There were mornings when the light arrived so gently over the water that it seemed less an intrusion than a negotiation, as if the day itself were asking permission to begin. On those mornings, Margaret Hale would already be awake, seated at the narrow table beside the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since cooled, watching the horizon assemble itself out of a grey indistinction into something that could be named sea, sky, the faint outline of the distant ferry that came and went, whether she marked its passage or not. It had not always been her habit to wake so early, though she could no longer say precisely when the change had occurred. Perhaps it was after she had come to the island, or perhaps even earlier, when the hours of sleep had begun to feel less like restoration and more like a soft erasure, one she did not entirely trust. There was a comfort, she found, in witnessing the day from its first suggestion, in assuring herself that nothing essential had taken place beyond her awareness. The house itself, modest and slightly removed from the others that clustered nearer the small harbour, bore the quiet marks of long habitation without insistence. The floorboards, though worn, did not creak in complaint, and the walls held their paint with a subdued dignity, as though they had accepted the inevitability of time without resistance. Margaret had chosen the house for its distance, though she told herself it was for the view, and for the way the wind moved differently here, less obstructed, more continuous, as though it carried something unbroken from elsewhere. Her days were arranged with a deliberate simplicity. After her morning coffee, she would walk along the narrow path that curved toward the town, passing the same weathered fences and low shrubs that had grown accustomed to her quiet presence. She would stop at the small market, exchange a few words, never many, with the clerk, and then continue to the shoreline where she would sit, not always looking at the water, but always aware of it, its steady, indifferent motion. It was on one of these mornings, indistinguishable at first from any other, that she found herself pausing before the old theatre. She could not have said why she stopped. The building had been there for as long as she had lived on the island, its facade weathered into a muted anonymity that neither invited nor repelled attention. The sign above the entrance, once painted in bold lettering, had faded to a pale suggestion of his former self, the name still legible if one knew how to look. The Sea View. Margaret had passed it countless times without a second thought, or so she believed, and yet, standing there now, she felt an unfamiliar hesitation, as though she had arrived not by chance, but by a series of decisions she had not fully registered. The doors were closed, though not secured. One of them rested slightly ajar, its angle so slight that it might have been overlooked entirely had the morning light not caught the thin line of darkness within. She stood for a moment listening. There was at first nothing, only the distant sound of the tide withdrawing itself from the shore, the faint rustle of wind moving through the grasses, and then, or perhaps only after she had allowed herself to imagine it, there came a second sound, quieter and less certain, a low, intermittent hum, as though something within the building had not entirely ceased its function. Margaret did not think of herself as curious, at least not in the way that compelled action. Her life had been shaped in part by a preference for observation over intrusion, for allowing things to remain as they were rather than pressing upon them for explanation. And yet she found her hand reaching toward the door, her fingers resting briefly against the cool surface before applying the slightest pressure. The door yielded without resistance. Inside, the air held a stillness that felt both preserved and unsettled, as though it had been waiting, though for what she could not say. The scent of dust was immediate, though not unpleasant, carrying with it a faint trace of something older, fabric perhaps, or the lingering residues of a time when the space had been occupied by more than silence. The lobby was dim, the light from the doorway extending only a short distance before dissolving into shadow. The ticket counter stood to one side, its glass dulled by a thin film of neglect, and beyond it the entrance to the auditorium opened like a darkened corridor, its interior obscured. Margaret stepped forward, her movements careful, though she was not aware of any particular reason for caution. The floor beneath her feet responded with a soft, measured creak, not in protest, but in acknowledgment, as though it recognized the return of a presence it had not entirely forgotten. She paused again at the threshold of the auditorium. There was a quality to the darkness within that felt less like absence and more like accumulation, as though the space had gathered something over time and held it there, intact but inaccessible. The rows of seats emerged gradually. As her eyes adjusted, their shapes softened by the dust that had settled upon them in a patient, unbroken layer. And then, without warning, the lights came on. It was not a sudden illumination, but a slow and deliberate brightening, as though the theatre itself were recalling the process rather than enacting it. One by one the overhead fixtures flickered to life, their glow uneven at first, before stabilizing into a steady, if subdued, brightness. Margaret did not move. There was no immediate sense of alarm, only a profound and inexplicable stillness, as though the moment had detached itself from the sequence of events that should have preceded or followed it. The hum she had heard outside was now more distinct, resolving itself into a mechanical rhythm she could not immediately identify. And then she did. From somewhere behind her, beyond the wall that separated the auditorium from the projection room, there came the unmistakable sound of a projector beginning to run, a low, continuous whir, punctuated by the faint, regular click of something passing through its mechanism. Margaret turned her head slightly, though she did not look away from the screen. It remained blank, a pale surface that reflected the newly awakened light without offering anything of its own. For a moment she wondered if the sound would cease, if the mechanism would falter and return the space to its previous state of suspension. But it did not. The projector continued, steady and unbroken, as though it had always been in motion, and she had only now become aware of it. Margaret stood there for a long time, long enough that the distinction between waiting and remaining began to blur, until, without any clear decision, she stepped back, retracing her path through the lobby and out into the morning light. Outside, the day had fully arrived. The sea was brighter now, the sky resolved into a clear, unambiguous blue, and the distant ferry had already come and gone, leaving behind no trace of its passage. Margaret paused once more, her hand resting briefly against the door before she allowed it to fall closed. She did not look back, and yet, as she resumed her walk toward the town, there remained with her a quiet and persistent awareness, not of what she had seen, but of what had not yet been shown. It was not until the following day that Margaret found herself returning, though in the intervening hours she would have denied any intention of doing so. The memory of the theatre had not intruded upon her thoughts in any overt or insistent manner. Rather, it had settled into her awareness with a subtlety that made it difficult to distinguish from the ordinary accumulation of impressions that comprised her days. And yet, when she altered her path, only slightly, she told herself, only enough to pass again by the building, It did not feel like a deviation so much as a continuation. The morning bore a different quality, the light less tentative than it had been before, the air carrying a sharper edge that suggested a change not yet fully realized. Margaret moved with her usual deliberation, her attention dispersed across the familiar elements of her surroundings, though she could not have said, if asked, what she had noticed. When the theatre came into view, it appeared unchanged. The façade remained as it had been, the sign no more legible than before, the door resting at the same slight angle. There was nothing to suggest that the events of the previous morning had occurred at all, nothing that would compel a second glance from anyone passing by. Margaret stopped. For a moment she considered the possibility that she had imagined it, that the light, the sound, the subtle activation of a space long abandoned had been nothing more than a transient distortion, a misalignment between perception and reality that had resolved itself without consequence. It was not an unreasonable thought. She had, in recent years, become increasingly aware of the ways in which memory could adjust itself, smoothing over certain details while amplifying others, creating a coherence that did not always correspond to what had been. And yet the thought did not settle. She approached the door. This time she did not hesitate before opening it. The lobby greeted her with the same muted stillness, the same accumulation of dust and silence, as though it had resumed its suspended state the moment she had left. There was no immediate sound, no hum to suggest that anything within the building remained active. Margaret stepped inside, allowing the door to close behind her with a soft, almost inaudible click. She moved more quickly now, though not hurriedly, as if guided by an expectation she had not fully acknowledged. The threshold of the auditorium came into view, and she paused there only briefly before continuing forward. The lights were already on. This time they did not flicker into being. They simply were, illuminating the space with the same subdued brightness as before. The rows of seats extended before her in quiet repetition, their surfaces undisturbed except for the fine layer of dust that bore no mark of recent passage. Margaret felt then a subtle shift, not in the space itself, but in her relation to it. It was as though the theatre had adjusted its recognition of her presence, not as something incidental or unexpected, but as part of a pattern it had anticipated. She took a seat in the third row, slightly to the left of centre. The fabric beneath her was cool, the cushion yielding with a softness that suggested it had not entirely lost its form. She rested her hands in her lap, her posture composed, though she could not have said what she was waiting for. For a time nothing happened. The silence held, uninterrupted, and the screen remained blank, its surface reflecting only the ambient light. Margaret found her attention drifting, not away from the space, but deeper into it, as though she were listening for something that had not yet made itself known. And then, gradually, the sound began. It was the same as before, the low, continuous whir of the projector, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic clicking that marked the passage of film through its mechanism. The sound emerged not as an interruption, but as a continuation, as though it had always been present at a level just below her awareness. Margaret did not turn to look behind her. Instead, she focused on the screen. At first, there was nothing, only the pale surface, unchanged, and then, almost imperceptibly, a flicker appeared, so faint that it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light. It persisted. The flicker deepened, resolving itself into movement, though without form. shadows shifted across the surface, indistinct and without clear origin, as though the image were struggling to assemble itself from fragments that did not yet align. Margaret felt a tightening in her chest, not of fear, but of recognition. The image clarified it was a room, though not one she could immediately identify. The perspective was slightly off, as though the scene were being viewed from a position not entirely consistent with natural sight. The colours were muted, the edges softened, as though time had worn away their precision. A table, a window, the suggestion of a figure moving just beyond the frame. Margaret leaned forward, her hands tightening slightly in her lap. The scene shifted. Now the figure was visible, a woman standing near the window, her back turned. There was something familiar in the posture, in the way the shoulders held themselves with a restrained tension, as though balancing between stillness and movement. Margaret knew, before she allowed herself to think it, that the woman was her, and yet there was something wrong. The angle was incorrect, the perspective too distant, as though the scene were being observed from a place she had never occupied. The memory, if it was a memory, did not align with her own recollection of it, though she could not have said precisely how. The woman at the window did not turn. Instead, she remained there, her stillness extending beyond what seemed natural, until the image began to waver, the edges dissolving once more into indistinct motion. The screen went blank. The sound of the projector continued for a few moments longer, and then, with a soft, final click, it ceased. The lights remained on. Margaret did not move. There was within her a quiet but unmistakable disturbance, not of alarm, but of dissonance, as though something she had accepted without question had shifted, revealing a structure she did not fully recognize. She became aware then of another sensation. It was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the natural awareness of space, but it persisted, a faint and steady impression that she was not alone, not in any tangible sense. There was no sound, no movement to suggest the presence of another person within the theatre, and yet the feeling remained, as though, from somewhere just beyond her field of vision, she were being observed, not with hostility, nor even with intention, but with a quiet and unwavering attention that did not waver or recede. Margaret remained seated for a long time after the screen had gone dark, her gaze fixed upon its blank surface. When she finally stood, the movement felt less like a decision than a necessity, as though the space itself had reached a point beyond which it would not extend. She made her way back through the rows of seats, her steps measured, her awareness attuned to the subtle echoes that followed each movement. At the threshold, she paused. The sensation of being observed lingered, though it had softened, receding into something less distinct, but no less present. Margaret did not turn to look. She stepped into the lobby, then out into the morning light. The day continued, unchanged. But as she walked away from the theatre, she carried with her a quiet and persistent certainty that what she had seen was not merely a recollection, but a variation, and that somewhere within that variation something essential had been altered. That afternoon, the light shifted earlier than she expected, though whether this was a quality of the season or of her attention, she could not determine with any certainty. Margaret found herself noticing the angle at which it entered the house, how it rested along the floorboards in long, deliberate bands that seemed to linger with an intention she had not previously ascribed to such things. She had returned from the town without incident, her purchases minimal, her exchanges with others even more so. There had been no interruption to the pattern of the day, nothing that would distinguish it from the many that had preceded it. And yet the sense of continuity she ordinarily relied upon, the quiet assurance that one moment followed another in a stable and predictable sequence, had become subtly unreliable. She moved through the house with a careful attention, not to anything in particular, but to the act of moving itself. The kettle, when she placed it on the stove, seemed to take longer to reach its quiet insistence. The cup, when she lifted it, felt slightly heavier than it should have, as though it carried with it some additional weight she could not name. It occurred to her, though she did not pursue the thought, that something had shifted not in the world, but in her relation to it, that the same objects, the same spaces, were now being perceived through a different alignment, one that rendered them faintly unfamiliar. By early evening the wind had risen. It came from the water with a steadiness that did not vary, pressing itself against the house in long uninterrupted intervals, as though testing its structure not for weakness but for memory. The windows responded with a soft, intermittent vibration, and somewhere within the walls there was the low, almost inaudible suggestion of movement, as though the house were adjusting itself to accommodate the pressure. Margaret sat in the chair beside the window, her book open but unread in her lap. She had intended earlier in the day to occupy herself with the ordinary tasks that had once provided a measure of quiet distraction. There were letters she had not answered, though no one had asked for a reply. There were drawers that could have been arranged, objects that might have been sorted into a more deliberate order, but each intention had dissolved before it could take form, leaving behind only a residual awareness of something deferred. The image from the theatre returned to her, not with clarity, but with a persistence that resisted dismissal. The room, the window, the figure, it would have been possible, she knew, to dismiss it as an artifact of suggestion, a construction shaped by the atmosphere of the space and the subtle influence of expectation. The mind she had come to understand was capable of producing such images, of assembling fragments into something that resembled memory without being anchored in it. And yet there had been something within the scene that did not align with this explanation. It was not merely that the perspective had been unfamiliar, though that alone would have been sufficient to unsettle her. It was the quality of the observation itself, the sense that the moment had not been recalled, but recorded as though it had existed independently of her awareness and had only now been made visible. She closed her eyes briefly, not in an effort to recall the image, but to allow it to settle. In its place, another memory, or something that resembled one, began to emerge. It was not the same room, though it shared certain qualities. The suggestion of a window, the presence of light that did not fully illuminate the space, leaving certain areas in a soft and deliberate shadow. There was a voice, though she could not distinguish the words, only the cadence, the particular rhythm that belonged to someone she had once known well enough to recognize without effort. She opened her eyes. The room around her returned, unchanged. The wind continued its steady pressure against the house, and the light had begun to recede, withdrawing itself from the floor and leaving behind a dim, even greyness that softened the edges of everything it touched. Margaret rose, moving toward the window. From here she could see the outline of the theatre in the distance, its form partially obscured by the structures that stood between it and the shore. It appeared no different from before, silent, unoccupied, its presence absorbed into the larger stillness of the town. And yet she felt, with a certainty that did not require articulation, that it was not at rest. The thought did not alarm her. It settled instead into a place she recognized, though she could not immediately name it, a place where certain understandings resided without the need for confirmation, where something could be known without being examined too closely. She remained at the window until the light had fully withdrawn, leaving the glass reflective, the outside world replaced by the faint suggestion of her own image. For a moment she did not recognize herself. It was not that the features were unfamiliar, but that they seemed arranged with a slight discrepancy, as though the reflection had not fully aligned with the person who stood before it. The expression, if it could be called that, held a quality she had not intended, a stillness that suggested not absence, but restraint. Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface of the glass. The reflection responded, though not immediately. There was perhaps only the slightest delay, no more than a fraction of a second, but it was enough to register, not as an error, but as a variation. She withdrew her hand. The image settled, the moment passed, and yet, as she turned away, there remained with her a quiet, an insistent awareness that something within the sequence of her perceptions had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to introduce a subtle and persistent doubt. That night she did not sleep as she ordinarily did. There were no dreams she could recall, no distinct interruptions to mark the passage of time. And yet, when morning came, she carried with her the impression that she had not been entirely alone in the darkness, not in the physical sense, but in some more elusive way, as though her thoughts had been accompanied by another presence, one that did not intrude, but observed. She rose before the light had fully returned, and without allowing herself to consider the decision, she prepared to leave the house. The path to the theatre was not direct, though Margaret found that she did not deviate from it. The morning was colder than the previous day, the air carrying a clarity that sharpened the edges of things, rendering them more precise, but somehow less substantial, as though they existed at a slight remove from themselves. The town had not yet fully awakened. The market remained closed, its windows dark, and the few figures that moved along the street did so with a quiet purpose that did not invite acknowledgment. Margaret did not slow as she approached the theatre. There was no hesitation this time, no pause in which to consider the possibility of turning away. The door, as before, was slightly ajar, and she opened it without resistance, stepping inside with a familiarity that felt unearned. The lobby was unchanged. If anything, the stillness seemed more complete, as though it had settled more deeply into the space, filling it with a density that was not immediately perceptible, but nonetheless present. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint, persistent scent of dust, and something else, something she could not immediately identify, though it suggested a lingering trace of human presence long since diminished. She moved through the space without stopping. The auditorium received her with its now familiar dim brightness, the lights already on, their steady glow casting soft, diffuse shadows that did not quite resolve. The rows of seats extended before her, their repetition creating a quiet rhythm that drew the eye forward toward the screen. Margaret did not take the same seat as before. She moved farther back this time, settling into a position that offered a wider view of the space, though she was not certain why this seemed necessary. The fabric of the seat was colder here, less yielding, as though it had been less frequently occupied, or perhaps as though it had not yet adjusted to her presence. She sat. The silence held, and then, almost immediately, the projector began. The sound was more distinct now, less tentative, as though the mechanism had gained confidence in its function. It filled the space with a steady, continuous rhythm that did not fluctuate, did not falter, but persisted with a quiet insistence that seemed to establish its own measure of time. Margaret's gaze fixed upon the screen. The image appeared more quickly this time, resolving itself without the previous hesitation into a scene that was, at once, more defined and more difficult to place. It was the same room, or rather, it resembled it closely enough that the distinction was not immediately clear. The table, the window, the arrangement of light and shadow, all were present, though altered in ways that resisted precise identification. The figure was there again, but now she was seated. Margaret felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she recognized the posture, the angle of the shoulders, the way the hands rested upon the surface of the table, not in stillness, but in a kind of restrained movement, as though they had been interrupted in the act of doing something that no longer seemed necessary. The perspective was different. Closer now, though not aligned with her own point of view. It was as though the scene were being observed from across the room, from a position that suggested not participation, but presence. The woman, herself, lifted her head. For a moment she did not turn, and then, slowly, she did. Margaret leaned forward. The face that came into view was hers, but not as she remembered it. There was something in the expression, something that did not correspond to any recollection she could readily access. It was not unfamiliar exactly, but it carried a quality she had not associated with herself, a kind of guardedness that bordered on calculation, as though the moment required a response she had not yet decided how to give. The image shifted. Another figure entered the frame, at first only partially visible, a shoulder, the outline of a hand resting briefly against the back of a chair, then, more fully, though still not entirely clear, as though the image resisted granting complete access. Margaret felt a quiet recognition, not of the face, which remained indistinct, but of the presence, the way it occupied the space, the particular stillness that accompanied it, as though it carried with it an awareness that extended beyond the immediate moment. There was a suggestion of speech. The movement of the mouth, the slight inclination of the head. Though no sound emerged, no words to anchor the exchange in something that could be understood. Margaret found herself straining to listen. The silence, however, remained intact. The scene held for a moment longer, suspended in a kind of incomplete articulation, before the image began to falter, the edges softening, the figures dissolving back into the indistinct motion from which they had emerged. The screen went dark. The projector continued, its sound unchanged, as though it had not registered the absence of image as a deviation from its purpose. Margaret remained seated. The presence, if it could be called that, was more distinct now. It was not located in any specific part of the room, not something she could point to or avoid by turning away. It existed instead as a condition of the space itself, a quiet and persistent awareness that extended to the edges of her perception. She became conscious then of the seats around her, the empty rows extending outward and upward, their surfaces undisturbed yet somehow attentive, as though they held within them the residue of those who had once occupied them. There was, in their arrangement, a suggestion of observation, not directed, not intentional, but inherent, as though the act of watching had become embedded in the structure itself. Margaret did not look behind her, and yet she felt, with increasing certainty, that the perspective from which the scene had been shown did not belong to her. It belonged to someone who had been present, someone who had watched. The thought did not arrive fully formed. It assembled itself gradually, its implications unfolding with a quiet inevitability that did not allow for immediate resistance. Margaret stood. The movement felt measured, though she had not consciously decided to make it. She remained where she was for a moment, her gaze still fixed upon the blank screen, as though expecting it to resume. It did not. The projector continued. The sound filled the space, and beneath it, so faint that it might have been imagined, there was another sound, not mechanical, not continuous, a subtle shift, the suggestion of breath. Margaret turned her head slightly, though not enough to alter her field of vision in any meaningful way. The sensation intensified, not in volume, but in presence, as though, from somewhere just beyond the reach of sight, someone stood at the edge of the space, observing not the screen, but her. She did not turn. After a moment, the sound receded, or perhaps it had never been there at all. Margaret exhaled, though she had not been aware of holding her breath. She moved toward the aisle, her steps deliberate, the soft echo of her movement absorbed into the larger stillness. At the threshold, she paused once more. The presence remained, not insistent, not demanding, but undeniably there. Margaret stepped into the lobby, and as she did, there came to her, not as a thought, but as a quiet recognition, the understanding that what she was witnessing was not merely a reconstruction. It was a perspective, and it was not her own. In the days that followed, Margaret did not attempt to impose any structure upon her return to the theatre, though she could not deny that a pattern had begun to take shape, one that revealed itself less through intention than through repetition. Each morning, after the quiet ritual of coffee and the measured preparation of the day, she found her steps aligning, almost imperceptibly, with a path that led past the building, and then, without any clear moment of decision, toward its door. There was a part of her that observed this with a degree of distance, as though the actions belonged not entirely to her, but to some adjacent version of herself who had adopted a different set of priorities. And yet she did not resist it. Resistance, she sensed, would require a clarity she did not possess, a conviction that something was being interrupted rather than continued. The town, in its modest constancy, offered no commentary on these changes. The few people she encountered, those whose presence had become familiar without ever approaching intimacy, continued their routines with a consistency that might have been reassuring under other circumstances. The clerk at the market nodded as before, his expression neither inquisitive nor indifferent, but settled into a neutrality that did not invite elaboration. The woman who walked her dog along the shore did not alter her pace or her path, though once Margaret thought she detected a brief pause, a hesitation that resolved itself before it could be confirmed. It occurred to her, fleetingly, that if anything had changed, it had done so entirely within her, leaving the external world untouched. And yet, even this thought did not fully settle. The theatre, when she entered it on the third morning, felt neither more nor less familiar than it had before. The lobby retained its muted stillness. the air cool and faintly scented with dust, the ticket counter unchanged in its quiet resignation. There was, perhaps, a slight variation in the light, a difference so subtle that it could not be attributed with certainty to anything beyond the natural shifts of the day. Margaret moved through the space with an ease that bordered on inevitability. The auditorium received her as it had the day before, the lights already on, their subdued glow casting the same soft illumination across the rows of seats. She chose a different position this time, neither closer nor farther from the screen, but offset in a way that seemed, though she could not say why, more appropriate. She sat. The projector began almost immediately. There was no delay now, no gradual emergence of sound. The mechanism engaged with a steady confidence, its rhythm established without hesitation, as though the process it enacted had become assured of its own continuation. Margaret directed her attention to the screen. The image appeared with a clarity that was, at once, more defined and more unsettling than before. It was not the room she had seen previously, or rather, it was a different moment within what might have been the same space. Though the arrangement had shifted, the light altered in a way that suggested a different time of day, or perhaps a different day altogether. The window was present, though the light that entered through it was lower, more diffuse, casting longer shadows that extended across the floor and along the walls. The table remained, but now there were objects upon it, a glass, a folded piece of paper, and beside them a hand. Margaret felt the recognition before she allowed herself to name it. The hand belonged to her, or to the version of herself that existed within the frame, though the distinction between the two had begun to blur in a way that resisted clear articulation. The fingers rested against the surface of the table, their position suggesting neither rest nor movement, but something suspended between the two, as though they had been caught in the act of withdrawing. The perspective had shifted again. Closer now, though still not aligned with her own experience, it was as though the scene were being observed from a position slightly to the side, angled in such a way that it revealed more than she had ever consciously seen, yet withheld the context that might have made it comprehensible. The hand moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fingers curled inward, drawing away from the paper, leaving it untouched. Margaret felt a quiet tightening in her chest. There was something in the gesture that suggested not hesitation, but decision, a movement that had been considered, perhaps even rehearsed, before being enacted. The image shifted. Now the frame widened, revealing more of the room, the table, the figure seated beside it, her. There was no longer any ambiguity in the recognition, and yet the expression on the face did not align with any recollection she could access. It was not unfamiliar, but it carried a quality she had not preserved in her memory, a composure that bordered on detachment, as though the moment had been approached with a deliberate distancing, a refusal to fully inhabit it. The paper remained on the table. Margaret found herself focusing on it, though she could not read what was written there. The edges were slightly worn, the surface marked by lines that suggested handwriting, though the words themselves were indistinct, as though they resisted being brought into clarity. The other figure entered the frame, this time more fully visible, though still not entirely defined. The outline of a man standing slightly apart from the table, his posture composed, his presence neither intrusive nor withdrawn, but held in a balance that suggested restraint. Margaret felt a recognition that was both immediate and incomplete. She did not see his face clearly, and yet she knew him, not through detail, but through something more elusive, something embedded in the way he occupied the space, the particular stillness that accompanied him. He did not move closer. He remained where he was, his attention directed toward the woman at the table, toward her. There was a moment, a pause that extended beyond what seemed natural, as though it held within it the weight of something unspoken. The woman, Margaret, did not look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the paper, though her hand had withdrawn from it, resting now at her side. The man shifted slightly, not forward, not away, but in a manner that suggested the adjustment of perspective, as though he were attempting to see something more clearly. Margaret became aware, then, of the angle from which the scene was being shown. It was not neutral. It was not observational in the detached sense she had initially assumed. It was positioned, deliberately, as though the frame itself had been chosen to reflect not merely the event, but the experience of witnessing it. The realization did not arrive fully formed, but it began to take shape, assembling itself from the fragments she had already encountered. This was not her memory, or not only hers. The image wavered, the edges softened, the figures dissolving into the indistinct motion that preceded disappearance. The screen went dark. The projector continued for a moment longer, and then, with a soft and final cessation, it fell silent. Margaret remained seated. There was within her a growing awareness that did not yet cohere into understanding, but that nonetheless insisted upon its presence. She had not remembered this moment, or rather, she had remembered it differently. The paper, the gesture, the stillness, they existed, she was certain, within her past, but not in the form she had been shown. She had, perhaps, omitted something, or altered it. The distinction, she sensed, might no longer be meaningful. She stood slowly. The auditorium seemed larger now, the rows of seats extending outward with a quiet persistence that suggested not emptiness, but accumulation, as though they held within them the residue of each moment that had passed through the space, each observation, each unspoken response. Margaret moved toward the aisle. As she did, the sensation returned, not sudden, not overwhelming, but present. A quiet awareness of being observed, not from the seats, not from any identifiable location, but from somewhere within the structure of the space itself. She did not turn. Instead, she allowed the sensation to remain, neither acknowledged nor dismissed, as she made her way toward the exit. At the threshold she paused. There was something she felt she should remember. Not the image, not the scene, but something that existed just beyond them, a detail that had not yet been revealed, but that pressed faintly against the edges of her awareness. She waited. Nothing came. Margaret stepped into the lobby and then into the light beyond. The day continued, but within her something had begun to loosen, not yet enough to break, but enough to suggest that what she had accepted as fixed might, in fact, be subject to revision. It was not until the following afternoon that Margaret returned, though the interval between visits did not restore the sense of distance she might once have relied upon. Instead, it seemed to compress the experience, drawing the previous images closer to the present moment, as though they had not concluded but merely paused. She found herself recalling details she had not consciously registered. The precise angle of the man's stance, the subtle movement of her own hand, the position of the paper on the table, these elements surfaced without effort, assembling themselves into a sequence that felt both incomplete and insistently present. There was, however, something else, an absence, a portion of the memory, if it could be called that did not reveal itself, though its omission was increasingly apparent. Margaret did not attempt to define it. She had begun to understand that the act of forcing clarity upon these impressions only served to distort them further, to introduce a structure that did not belong to them. It was better, she sensed, to allow them to emerge in their own manner, even if that manner remained elusive. The afternoon carried a muted stillness. The wind had subsided, leaving the air unusually calm, as though the island itself had entered a brief suspension. The water, visible from the path, moved with a subdued rhythm, its surface reflecting the overcast sky in a manner that blurred the distinction between depth and surface. When Margaret reached the theatre, the door was closed. For a moment she stood before it, her attention drawn to the absence of the slight opening that had until now marked her entry. The surface of the wood appeared unchanged, though the difference in its position introduced a subtle resistance, not physical, but perceptual, as though the sequence of events had been interrupted. She placed her hand against it. The door opened easily. Inside, the lobby felt cooler than before. The air held a density that suggested not merely stillness, but containment, as though something had been held within the space for a duration that could not be measured. Margaret moved through it without pausing, her steps quieter now, though she had not consciously altered them. The auditorium awaited. The lights were on, but they seemed dimmer, not in intensity, but in quality, as though their illumination had been filtered through something that softened its reach, leaving certain areas in a deeper shadow than before. Margaret hesitated, only briefly, and then she entered. She did not take a seat immediately. Instead, she remained standing near the back, her attention moving across the rows of seats, the screen, the walls that enclosed the space. There was a difference here, though it resisted precise identification, a subtle alteration in the arrangement of perception, as though the space had adjusted itself in response to her continued presence. The projector did not begin at once. The silence extended. Margaret felt then a shift, not external, internal, a quiet unease that did not rise to the level of alarm, but that nonetheless unsettled the balance she had maintained. It was as though the expectation she had carried with her, the assumption that the sequence would continue as before, had been interrupted. She took a step forward, and at that moment the projector engaged. The sound was sharper this time, more immediate, as though it had been initiated not by the mechanism itself, but by her movement. Margaret did not sit. She remained where she was, her gaze fixed upon the screen. The image appeared, not gradually, not in fragments, but whole. It was the same room, the same table, the same arrangement of light, but now the perspective was unmistakable. It was not hers, nor was it entirely external. It was positioned behind the man. Margaret felt the recognition before she understood it. She was seeing the scene from his point of view. The woman herself sat at the table, the paper before her, her posture composed in the same restrained manner she had observed before, but now the distance between them was clear, the space defined not merely by physical separation, but by something less tangible, something that extended beyond the visible. The man took a step forward. The movement was slight, but it altered the frame, bringing the table, the paper, the woman into a sharper alignment. Margaret felt something within her shift, a memory or the beginning of one stirred, not fully formed, but insistent. The man spoke. There was no sound, and yet Margaret understood. in a way that did not rely on hearing that words had been spoken, words that carried a weight she had not preserved. The woman did not respond immediately. She remained still, her gaze lowered, her hand resting beside the paper. The man waited. There was something in the stillness that suggested not patience, but restraint, as though the moment had already exceeded its natural duration, and yet could not be concluded. Margaret felt a growing tension, not in the scene but within herself. There was something she was meant to remember, something that existed just beyond the edge of the image. The woman's hand moved, it hovered over the paper, and then, slowly, deliberately, it withdrew. The same gesture, the same decision, but now, seen from the other side, Margaret felt a sharp and sudden clarity, not of the entire moment, but of its significance. This had not been hesitation. It had been refusal. The image held. The man did not move. There was, in the stillness, a shift, subtle but unmistakable, as though something within him had altered, not outwardly, but in a way that changed the entire structure of the moment. Margaret felt it, not as an observation, but as an experience, the distance, the recognition, the quiet and irrevocable understanding that something had been decided and that it could not be undone. The screen flickered, the image dissolved, the projector continued for a moment longer and then fell silent. Margaret remained standing. Her breath came more slowly now, though she had not been aware of it changing. There was, within her, a growing awareness, not yet fully articulated, but undeniable. She had not remembered this, not as it had been. She had preserved something else, something easier, something that did not require her to see the moment from this perspective. Margaret turned slightly. The auditorium remained unchanged. The seats, the walls, the dim filtered light, and yet the sensation of presence was stronger now, closer, as though the distance between observer and observed had narrowed. Margaret did not turn fully. She did not look, but she knew, with a certainty that no longer required confirmation, that what she was encountering was not an intrusion. It was a correction, and that whatever remained hidden would not remain so for long. The interval between her visits began, without her quite noticing when, to lose its meaning. Where once there had been a distinction, morning and afternoon, before and after, there was now something more continuous, as though the hours had softened at their edges and no longer insisted upon their separation. Margaret still rose at the same time, still moved through the quiet sequence of her routines, but these gestures had taken on a quality of repetition that no longer reassured her. Instead, they seemed to echo, faintly, something that was occurring elsewhere, or perhaps earlier, or perhaps not bound to time at all. She did not speak of the theatre, not even to herself. The word, when it formed in her mind, felt insufficient, too fixed, too defined to contain what the place had become. It was no longer simply a building, nor even a repository of images. It had assumed a different function, one she hesitated to name, as though naming it might impose a boundary that it would not accept. On the fourth day, or what she believed to be the fourth, she found herself there before she could recall having made the journey. The door was open, not slightly ajar as before, but fully, as though it had been held in that position for some time, inviting or perhaps expecting entry. The light from outside extended farther into the lobby than it had previously, illuminating the floor in a broad pale shape that stopped abruptly at the threshold of the auditorium, beyond which the dim interior glow resumed its quiet dominion. Margaret paused only briefly before stepping inside. The air was warmer, not markedly so, but enough to register as a change. The scent of dust remained, though it was less pronounced, as though it had been disturbed or displaced. There was, in its place, a faint trace of something else, something that suggested not decay, but presence, as though the space had been recently occupied in a way that did not leave visible marks. She moved forward. The auditorium opened before her, the rows of seats unchanged in their arrangement, though they seemed now to recede differently, their alignment less rigid, as though the perspective had shifted in some subtle but significant way. The lights were on, but they flickered, not continuously, not in a way that suggested failure, but intermittently, as though responding to something that passed through the space at irregular intervals. Each flicker altered the shadows, briefly deepening them, then releasing them back into their former softness. Margaret did not take a seat. She remained standing near the centre aisle, her attention moving not directly to the screen, but across the space itself, as though she were attempting to locate the source of the change she felt, but could not yet define. The projector began. Its sound was louder now, more pronounced, the mechanical rhythm no longer confined to the background, but occupying the space with a presence that bordered on insistence. It did not overwhelm the silence, but it altered it, introducing a cadence that seemed to shape the very air. The image appeared, not the room, not the table, something else. At first it was difficult to discern. A corridor, perhaps, or the suggestion of one. The perspective was narrow, the walls close, the light dim and uneven. There was movement, though not of figures, but of shadow, as though something passed just beyond the frame, altering the available light without revealing itself. Margaret felt a hesitation she had not experienced before. This was not a memory she recognized, or if it was, it had been altered to such a degree that its origin could not be immediately identified. The image stabilized. The corridor resolved into something more specific. A passageway, lined on one side with doors, on the other with a series of framed posters, their images faded but still faintly visible. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. The posters, she knew them, or rather, she knew the place they belonged to, the theatre, but not as it was now, as it had been. The realization did not arrive suddenly, but unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as though it had been present from the beginning, and had only now been allowed to take form. This was not a scene from her life, not directly. It was a space she had occupied, but not in the manner that the previous images had suggested. The perspective moved, slowly, steadily, as though the observer were walking. Margaret felt a subtle disorientation, not from the motion itself, but from the angle, the height, the rhythm of it. It did not correspond to her own movement, nor to any she could readily recall. The corridor extended, a door at the far end, closed. The movement continued. Margaret became aware then of a sound, faint, intermittent, not mechanical, a voice, or the suggestion of one. She strained to listen, though she knew, even as she did so, that there would be no words, no clarity to anchor the sound in something that could be understood. The door at the end of the corridor came into sharper focus. There was something written on it, a number, or a name. Margaret could not read it. The perspective paused. The hand, visible now at the edge of the frame, reached forward. It rested against the surface of the door. Margaret felt a sudden and inexplicable tension. This, too, was not her hand. The fingers were longer, the movement more deliberate, as though the act of touching the door required a consideration she did not associate with herself. The hand remained there for a moment, then withdrew. The perspective shifted, turned, and began to move away. The image flickered, the corridor dissolved, the screen went dark. The projector continued, its sound unchanged, though now it seemed to carry with it an echo, a faint reverberation that extended beyond the mechanical rhythm, suggesting something that lingered after the motion had ceased. Margaret stood very still. There was a new awareness within her, not of a specific memory, but of a space between memories, a place where something had occurred that she had not fully acknowledged, or perhaps had chosen not to retain. The corridor, the door, the hand that did not belong to her. She felt then the presence again, stronger, closer, not external, not entirely. It did not press upon her, did not intrude, it waited, as though allowing her the space to recognize what it had already revealed. Margaret turned her head slightly. The seats behind her remained empty, the walls unchanged, and yet the sensation persisted, not of being watched, but of being known in a way that did not permit alteration. She closed her eyes briefly. The image of the corridor remained, but now alongside it there was something else, a fragment, a sound, a voice, clearer now, though still indistinct. Not what was said, but how. She opened her eyes. The auditorium returned, but the distance between what she saw and what she remembered had narrowed, and in that narrowing something had begun to take shape. She did not intend to return that evening. The day had already extended beyond its usual boundaries, the light lingering longer than expected, as though reluctant to yield to the gradual encroachment of dusk. Margaret had remained in the house, moving through its rooms with a quiet attentiveness that did not settle into rest. The objects around her, familiar, unchanging, seemed to hold their positions with a subtle insistence, as though their constancy required her acknowledgment. She prepared her evening meal without appetite, the motions precise but detached, each action completed without the sense of completion that ordinarily accompanied it. When she sat, she found herself listening, not to anything in particular, but to the absence of sound, the way it gathered in the corners of the room, filling the spaces between her movements. It was then that she became aware of it, not a sound, not exactly, but the suggestion of one, a rhythm, faint, distant, and yet unmistakable, the projector. Margaret did not question it. The recognition came without surprise, as though it had been anticipated, though she could not recall having formed the expectation. She remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting on the table, her attention fixed not on the room around her, but on the direction from which the sensation seemed to arrive. The theatre. She stood. There was no hesitation now. The transition from stillness to movement felt seamless, as though it had already occurred, and she was only now becoming aware of it. Outside, the light had begun to fade. The sky held a muted, uncertain colour. Neither fully day nor fully night, the horizon blurred in a way that softened the distinction between sea and sky. The air was cooler, the wind absent, leaving the space between things unusually still. Margaret moved quickly, not hurriedly, but with a directness that did not allow for deviation. The path to the theatre seemed shorter, though she could not have said whether this was a function of distance or perception. The building emerged from the dimness, its outline less defined now, the edges softened by the fading light. The sign above the entrance was barely visible, its letters absorbed into the surface from which they had once stood apart. The door was open, wide as it had been before. Margaret entered. The lobby was darker than she expected. The light from outside did not extend as far, stopping just inside the doorway, leaving the remainder of the space in a subdued shadow. There was a shift in the air, cooler but also denser, as though it held something that resisted movement. The sound was clearer here. The projector, steady, continuous. Margaret moved toward the auditorium. The threshold felt different, not in its structure, but in its presence, as though crossing it required a recognition she hadn't previously acknowledged. She stepped inside. The lights were dim, not fully extinguished, but reduced to a level that left much of the space in shadow. The seats were visible only in outline, their form suggested rather than defined. The screen, however, was illuminated, not brightly, but with a focused clarity that drew the eye and held it. Margaret did not sit. She remained near the entrance, her attention fixed upon the image that had already begun. It was the room, the table, the window, but now the scene was different, not in its arrangement, but in its tension. There was movement. The woman herself stood by the table, her posture no longer composed, but unsettled, as though something within the moment had shifted beyond her control. The paper lay where it had been before, though now it seemed less an object than a presence, something that exerted a quiet influence over the space. The man was closer, his position altered, no longer at a distance, but within the immediate vicinity of the table, his presence no longer restrained by the balance he had previously maintained. Margaret felt a tightening in her chest. This was closer to something she recognized, and yet it remained incomplete. The man spoke. There was still no sound, but the movement was clearer now, the intention more defined, as though the absence of words only served to sharpen the significance of what was being said. The woman responded, her head lifted, her expression shifting, not into clarity, but into something more complex, something that held within it both resistance and something else she could not immediately name. Margaret leaned forward. The scene held, and then a change, subtle but unmistakable. The perspective shifted, not fully, not as it had before, but enough, as though the observer had moved slightly, adjusting their position to capture something that had previously been obscured. Margaret felt it, not as a visual change, but as a sensation, a displacement, as though she were no longer entirely aligned with the version of herself on the screen. The woman's hand moved again, toward the paper. It hovered, the same gesture, the same moment, but now there was hesitation, not the absence of decision, but its presence. Margaret felt a sudden and sharp awareness. This was the point, the moment she had preserved differently, the moment that had been altered. The woman's hand trembled, only slightly, but enough. The man did not move. He watched, not passively, but with a stillness that suggested an awareness of what was about to occur. Margaret felt the presence again, closer than before, not behind her, not around her, but within the space of the scene itself, as though the perspective from which she watched had begun to overlap with another. The woman withdrew her hand. Again, the same decision. But now, Margaret understood. This was not how she had remembered it. There had been something else, something before, something after. The image flickered, the light shifted, and for a brief moment, so brief that it might have been imagined, another version of the scene appeared. The hand did not withdraw. It moved forward, touched the paper. Margaret inhaled sharply. The image vanished, replaced by the version she had already seen. The withdrawal, the refusal, the stillness that followed. The screen went dark. The projector continued. Margaret stood motionless. Her heart, though steady, carried a weight she had not felt before. There had been two possibilities, two versions, and she had kept only one. The presence remained, not distant, not separate, but intertwined now with her perception, as though the boundary between observer and memory had begun to dissolve. Margaret did not leave immediately. She remained there, in the dim light, the steady sound of the projector continuing its quiet, relentless rhythm. And within that rhythm she felt something else, not a sound, not a movement, but a recognition that what had been shown was not yet complete, and that what remained would not allow itself to be refused again. By the time the next morning arrived, Margaret no longer experienced the separation between what she had seen and what she remembered as a distinction she could rely upon. The two had begun to overlap in ways that were neither abrupt nor entirely perceptible, but which nonetheless altered the structure of her thoughts with a quiet and persistent insistence. She rose later than usual, though the light suggested that the hour was not yet advanced. There was a heaviness in her limbs, not fatigue precisely, but something closer to resistance, as though her body had retained a memory of stillness that it was reluctant to relinquish. When she moved, the motion felt delayed, as though each action required a brief negotiation before it could proceed. The house, in its familiar arrangement, seemed to hold itself at a slight remove. Margaret moved through its rooms with the same careful attention she had adopted in recent days, though now that attention was accompanied by a subtle uncertainty, not about where things were, but about how long they had been so. The chair by the window, the cup she had left on the table, the book resting where she had abandoned it, each object presented itself as both known and newly encountered, as though its presence could not be entirely anchored in a continuous past. She did not attempt to correct this. Instead, she allowed it to remain, observing the way her perception adjusted around it, accommodating the discrepancy without resolving it. When she stepped outside, the air carried a softness that suggested the return of warmth. Though the sky remained overcast, the light diffused in a way that softened all distinctions. The path toward the town seemed unchanged, though Margaret found herself less inclined to follow its full length. The market, the shore, the small exchanges that had once punctuated her mornings, all of these now felt peripheral, as though they belonged to a pattern she had stepped slightly outside of. She turned, without hesitation, toward the theatre. There was no longer any question of whether she would go. The building stood as it had before, though now it seemed less like a structure within the town and more like a point of convergence, something toward which her movements were directed not by choice, but by a necessity she no longer examined. The door was open. The lobby received her in its usual stillness, though she thought for a moment that the air shifted as she entered, as though her presence altered something within it that could not be seen. The scent of dust remained, but it was lighter now, less settled, as though it had been disturbed repeatedly, and no longer had the opportunity to resettle into its former quiet accumulation. Margaret moved directly into the auditorium. The lights were dimmer still, not extinguished, but reduced to a level that left the space in a soft, encompassing shadow. The seats were barely visible now, their forms suggested only by the faintest gradation of light and dark. The screen, however, remained clear, its surface holding a pale, expectant brightness. Margaret did not sit. She stood near the centre, her attention fixed upon the screen, though she was aware increasingly of the space around her, not as emptiness, but as something that held within it a quiet and attentive presence. The projector began. Its sound was immediate, louder, not in volume alone, but in proximity, as though it no longer occupied a distant room, but had moved closer, its mechanism now embedded within the space itself. The image appeared, at once, without transition. It was the same room, but now it was complete. Margaret felt the shift before she understood it. The table, the window, the paper, the man, the woman, all present, all aligned. The perspective was no longer fixed. It moved, not smoothly, not with the controlled steadiness of the previous sequences, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible instability, as though it adjusted in response to something within the scene, rather than observing it from a predetermined position. Margaret felt a disorientation, not of place, but of relation, as though the vantage point from which she observed was no longer stable. The man stood near the table, closer than before. His face was still indistinct, though more visible now, the features emerging not in clarity, but in impression, enough to suggest recognition, but not enough to allow it to settle. He spoke. Again, no sound, but now. Margaret understood more, not the words, but the intention behind them. There was a question, or perhaps not a question, but something that required an answer. The woman, herself, stood opposite him. Her posture was different now, less composed, more immediate, as though the moment had advanced beyond the point where distance could be maintained. Her hand moved toward the paper. It hovered. Margaret felt the tension rise, not in the scene, but within herself. This was the moment, the same moment, repeated, and yet different. The perspective shifted, slightly, now positioned closer to the woman, closer to her face. Margaret saw then something she had not seen before, not clearly, but unmistakably, a hesitation, not in the gesture, but in the expression, a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, or doubt, something that had not been preserved. The hand remained suspended. The man did not move, but there was something in his stillness now, something altered. Margaret felt it, a withdrawal, not physical, but perceptual, as though in that moment something within him had begun to recede. The hand withdrew. Again, the same decision. But now, Margaret understood the cost of it. The scene did not dissolve immediately. It held. The stillness extended, and in that stillness something else became visible. Not in the figures, but between them, a space, not empty, but defined, as though the absence itself had taken form. The image flickered, shifted, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw the other version again, the hand moving forward, touching the paper, the man leaning closer, the space between them narrowing, and then gone, replaced by the version she knew, the withdrawal, the distance, the silence. The screen went dark. The projector continued. Margaret stood, her breath shallow, though she had not been aware of it changing. There was no longer any doubt. She had not simply forgotten. She had chosen. The presence was immediate now, not separate, not external, but within the same space of awareness, as though the perspective she had avoided had always been there. waiting. Margaret did not turn. She did not need to. The realization had already taken hold. The theatre was not showing her what she had been. It was showing her what she had refused to see, and now it was no longer allowing her to look away. She did not leave the theatre immediately. The darkness, once the screen had gone blank, did not feel like an absence, but like a continuation, an extension of the images that had preceded it, as though they had not ended but had simply withdrawn from visibility. Margaret remained where she was, her body still, her attention unsettled in a way that no longer sought resolution. There was a growing awareness within her that the process she had entered could not be interrupted at will, that it had advanced beyond the point where her participation could be withdrawn without consequence. The projector continued. Its sound, once distinct, had become something else, less mechanical, more pervasive, as though it had extended beyond its source, and now occupied the space in a manner that did not depend upon the physical apparatus that produced it. Margaret became aware then of another sound, subtle, intermittent, not separate from the projector, but layered within it, a breath. She did not move. The sensation of presence, which had until now remained diffuse, gathered itself, not in a single location, but in proximity, closer than before, as though the distance between observer and observed had narrowed to the point of contact. Margaret felt it, not against her, not as a physical intrusion, but as a recognition that did not require sight. She was not alone, not in the way she had previously understood it. The presence was not something that occupied the space beside her. It occupied the same moment, the same perception, as though the perspective from which the scenes had been shown had now aligned with her own. Margaret closed her eyes. The darkness did not change. If anything, it deepened, not in absence, but in density, as though it held within it the residue of all that had been shown. The room, the table, the paper, the man, the moment. She saw it again. Not on the screen, but within herself, and now there was sound, not clear, not articulated, but present, the voice, his voice. Margaret felt something shift, a memory, not of the event, but of the experience of it, began to surface, not fully, not yet, but enough. The cadence, the way he had spoken, not what he had said, but how. There had been restraint, and beneath it, something else, something she had not allowed herself to register. Margaret opened her eyes. The auditorium remained unchanged, the screen blank, the projector continuing its quiet, relentless motion. But the presence was no longer indistinct. It had taken on a form, not visible but defined in its position, relative to her, behind her, not at a distance, but close. Margaret felt the awareness of it with a clarity that did not require confirmation. She did not turn. There was no need. The understanding had already formed. This was not a separate entity, not something external. It was the perspective she had avoided, the presence of being seen, as she had been, as she had chosen. Margaret inhaled slowly. The air felt different now, heavier, as though it carried with it something that had not previously been accessible. She became aware then of another shift. The screen. It had not illuminated, and yet there was a change, a faint suggestion of light, not projected but emerging. Margaret directed her attention toward it. The surface remained pale, but within it a movement, not of image, but of depth, as though the screen no longer represented a boundary, but a threshold. Margaret felt a hesitation, not of fear, but of recognition. What remained had not yet been shown. The projector slowed, not abruptly, but gradually, its rhythm extending, the intervals between its movements lengthening, as though it approached something that required a different measure of time. The sound of breath, still faint, aligned with it. Margaret remained still. The presence behind her did not recede, it did not advance. It remained, as though waiting, not for her to act, but for her to understand. The screen flickered, once, twice, and then a new image began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to suggest a continuation. Margaret felt the weight of it before it resolved. This would not be another variation, not another perspective. It would be the moment itself, unaltered, unprotected. The projector resumed its steady rhythm. The light deepened, and Margaret, standing in the dim, quiet space of the theatre, understood that what she was about to see could no longer be set aside, because it had never truly been forgotten, only deferred, and now it had returned. The image did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, as though it required not only the mechanism of the projector, but something within Margaret herself to complete it, as if the act of seeing depended upon a corresponding willingness to allow what was seen to remain. At first there was only light, not the pale uniform brightness of the blank screen, but something deeper, more dimensional, as though it carried within it the suggestion of form not yet resolved. It gathered gradually, the faintest outlines appearing and dissolving again, as though the scene hesitated at the threshold of recognition. Margaret did not move. The presence behind her remained, not pressing, not intruding, but unmistakably there, aligned with her awareness in a way that no longer permitted distance. The room began to take shape, not as it had been shown before, fragmented, partial, or from a displaced perspective, but whole. The table, the window, the particular arrangement of light that fell across the surface in a narrow angled band, leaving the rest of the room in a quiet, enveloping shadow. Margaret felt something within her tighten. This was not a reconstruction. It was not an interpretation. It was the moment itself, or as close to it as memory, unprotected, could allow. The woman sat at the table. Margaret saw her without the mediation of distance, not from across the room, not from behind another presence, but directly, as she had been. The posture was familiar now, though no longer softened by the version she had previously accepted. There was a tension in it, a contained rigidity that suggested not composure, but effort. The paper lay before her, the edges worn, the surface marked. This time Margaret could almost read it. Not the words themselves, but the structure of them, the density, the length, the unmistakable indication that what was written was not casual, not incidental, but deliberate, important. The man stood nearby, not fully within the frame, but close enough that his presence altered the air of the scene. Margaret felt it, not as observation, but as something that pressed quietly against her own perception. He spoke, and now there was sound, not clear, not distinct, but present, a low restrained cadence. Margaret felt it before she understood it. Not the words, but the tone. There had been no accusation, no raised voice, only a measured insistence, as though what was being said had already been considered many times and now required no elaboration. The woman did not respond, not immediately. Her gaze remained on the paper. Her hand rested beside it, still, too still, Margaret felt a sudden and piercing recognition. This stillness, it had not been calm, it had been control. The image held. The man waited. There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as though something within the moment had reached a point from which it could not retreat. The woman's hand moved, not hesitantly, not as it had appeared in the earlier versions, but with deliberation. It rose, hovered above the paper. Margaret leaned forward, though she had not intended to move. This was the point, the moment that had divided itself, the moment she had altered. The hand trembled, only slightly, but enough. Margaret felt it, not as observation, but as a sensation within her own body, as though the gesture existed simultaneously in both places. The man spoke again, the sound clearer now, still indistinct, but closer. Margaret felt something shift within her. A fragment of meaning began to form, not complete, but undeniable. There had been a request, or perhaps not a request, something that required acknowledgment. The woman's hand remained suspended, and then it moved forward. Margaret inhaled sharply. The fingers touched the paper, lightly, as though testing his presence. The scene did not dissolve. It held. The man did not move, but something in him changed. Margaret felt it, not visibly, but unmistakably, a release, not of tension, but of expectation. The woman's hand remained on the paper. Her gaze lifted. Slowly, she looked at him, and for the first time, Margaret saw her expression clearly. There was no confusion, no uncertainty, only a quiet and resolute distance. Not from the moment, but from him. The realization struck with a force that did not manifest as shock, but as clarity. This had been the truth, not the hesitation, not the withdrawal, but this, the contact, the acknowledgment, and within it a refusal of a different kind, not the refusal to act, but the refusal to yield. The image flickered, but did not disappear. It shifted, as though another layer, previously concealed, had been allowed to surface. The woman spoke. Margaret heard it, not the words, but the structure of them, measured, controlled, final. The man's stillness deepened. Margaret felt something within the scene contract, not outwardly, but in a way that altered the space between them. The paper remained beneath her hand, the contact unbroken, the moment extended, and then it fractured, not abruptly, but with a quiet inevitability, as though the continuation of the scene no longer required visibility. The image dissolved, the screen dimmed, the projector continued. Margaret remained standing, her breath uneven now, though she had not been aware of its change until it demanded her attention. There was no confusion, not any more. She had not forgotten this moment. She had replaced it, reshaped it into something that required less of her, something that preserved a version of herself she could accept. But this had been the truth, and it had not disappeared. It had waited, patiently, for her to see it as it had been. The presence behind her did not move. It did not need to. Margaret understood now. It had never been separate. It had always been the part of the moment she had refused to carry. And now it remained, because she could no longer set it aside. Margaret did not leave. The boundary between what had been shown and where she stood had dissolved to the point where movement no longer seemed to correspond to departure. The theatre did not feel like a place she had entered. It felt instead like a space that had extended to include her, drawing her into a continuity that no longer acknowledged the distinction between observer and participant. The screen, though dimmed, retained a faint suggestion of depth, as though the image had not entirely withdrawn, but had settled into a layer just beyond immediate perception. The projector continued, its rhythm slower now, measured, as though it approached something that required a different pace, a different alignment of time. Margaret felt the present shift, not in position, but in clarity. It was no longer behind her, not in any meaningful sense. It had aligned fully with her awareness. The perspective she had once perceived as external had become indistinguishable from her own. She closed her eyes. The scene returned, not as it had been projected, but as it existed within her now, complete. The table, the paper, the man, the moment of contact, the expression she had seen, her own, no longer mediated by distance or distortion. Margaret felt a quiet and steady pressure, not from outside, but from within the memory itself. There was more, something that had not yet been shown, or that had been shown, but not fully understood. She opened her eyes. The screen flickered, not with an image, but with a subtle shift in light. Margaret stepped forward. The movement felt both intentional and inevitable, as though it had been anticipated by the space before she enacted it. The air was cooler near the screen, denser. She stopped a few steps away. The surface appeared unchanged, and yet there was a sense that it no longer represented a boundary, but an opening. Margaret felt a hesitation, not of fear, but of recognition. What remained was not simply to be seen, it was to be understood. The projector slowed further. The intervals between its movements extended, the sound no longer continuous but punctuated, as though each moment required its own articulation. The light deepened, and then the image returned, not the same, not entirely. The room was there, but altered, not in structure, but in emphasis. The table receded slightly, the window dimmed, the figures remained, but the space between them, that was where the change occurred. Margaret saw it now, not as absence, but as something defined, a distance that had not been created in that moment, but had existed before it. The scene did not move, it held, as though waiting. Margaret felt something within her shift, a realization, not new, but newly understood. The moment she had altered had not been the beginning, it had been the consequence. The man spoke, the sound clearer now, still not fully distinct, but enough. Margaret felt the meaning, not the words, but their weight. There had been something before this, something that had led to this moment, something she had not allowed herself to remember. The woman, herself, remained still, her hand still on the paper. But now, Margaret saw it, the distance in her expression, the absence of something that should have been there, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but connection. It was not present, and that absence had been there before the moment began. The realization settled slowly, with a weight that did not overwhelm, but remained. She had not withdrawn in that moment. She had already withdrawn, long before. The image flickered, shifted, and now another fragment emerged, earlier, the same room, the same figures, but the distance smaller, the space between them less defined, the man's posture different, closer, more open. Margaret felt something within her tighten. This was before the decision, before the alteration. The woman spoke. Margaret heard it, not the words, but the tone. There had been something in it, a subtle deflection, a turning away, not abrupt, not overt, but present, The man's response followed, quieter, measured, and within it something that had not yet been lost. The image held, and then shifted again, returning to the later moment. The paper, the hand, the contact, the distance now fully formed. Margaret understood, not all at once, but with a clarity that did not require completion. The moment she had remembered, the one in which she had withdrawn her hand, had allowed her to believe that the separation had occurred there, that it had been a single decision, a singular point, but this revealed something else. The separation had been gradual, constructed, maintained, and by the time of that final moment it had already been complete. Margaret felt a quiet stillness settle within her. Not relief, not resolution, but something closer to alignment. The presence remained, not watching, not waiting, but existing within the same understanding. The image faded, not abruptly, but with a soft dissolution, as though it no longer required form to persist. The screen dimmed, the projector slowed further. Margaret remained where she was, the air around her still, the space unchanged, and yet everything within her had shifted, not entirely, not conclusively, but enough to recognize that what she had avoided had not been a single moment, but a pattern, a continuity, and that the final scene, the one she had altered, had only concealed the extent of it. The projector came to a stop. The silence that followed was not empty. It held. Margaret did not move. She stood before the screen, aware now that what remained would not arrive as an image alone. It would require something else, something she had not yet fully allowed. And as she stood there, in the quiet and dim space of the theatre, she understood the final moment had not yet been shown, not completely, and when it came, it would not permit her to remain unchanged. It began without announcement. There was no preparatory flicker, no gradual accumulation of light to signal the arrival of what remained. The screen, which had held itself in a dim and patient suspension, altered almost imperceptibly, as though something within it had shifted rather than appeared. Margaret did not step back. She remained where she was, close enough now that the surface of the screen no longer presented itself as separate, but as something contiguous with the space she occupied. The air between her and the image felt thinner, as though the distance it once maintained had diminished to the point of irrelevance. The projector did not resume its former rhythm. Instead, there was a single extended movement, slow, deliberate, followed by a quiet stillness that did not suggest cessation, but concentration. The image formed, not the room, not the table, but the space immediately after. Margaret felt the recognition before she understood its structure, the same figures, but repositioned. The moment had advanced. The paper was no longer central. It remained on the table, but its significance had receded, replaced by something less tangible, yet more decisive. The man stood closer, not in proximity alone, but in presence, his attention no longer held in restraint, but directed fully, without mediation. The woman, herself, remained standing, her hand no longer on the paper, but at her side, still, composed, and yet there was something in the stillness that did not align with the composure she had previously preserved. Margaret felt it immediately. This was not control. It was conclusion. The man spoke. The sound was present now, faint but unmistakable. Margaret did not distinguish the words. She did not need to. The meaning was carried not in language, but in the shape of it, the cadence, the quiet insistence that did not demand but required acknowledgment. There was a question, or perhaps a statement that functioned as one. The woman did not respond, not at once. She remained where she was, her gaze steady, though not fixed upon him, as though she observed something just beyond his presence, something that allowed her to maintain the distance she had already established. Margaret felt a tightening within her. This was the point she had not retained, not the gesture, not the paper, but this, what followed. The man took a step forward, not abrupt, not forceful, but inevitable. The movement altered the space between them, not by closing it, but by redefining it. Margaret saw then something she had not seen before, not in him, but in herself, a slight shift in posture, a subtle inclination backward, not retreat, but refusal, the kind that does not declare itself, but is none the less absolute. The man stopped. He did not move further. There was, in his stillness, a recognition. Margaret felt it, not as observation, but as something that settled within her with a quiet and irrevocable weight. He understood, not what she said, but what she had already chosen. The woman spoke. Margaret heard it, clearer now than before, not the words, but the finality. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a measured and deliberate separation. The man's expression, still indistinct, shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register the moment at which something ended, not abruptly, not with force, but with a quiet and complete withdrawal. He stepped back, not quickly, not reluctantly, but with a precision that suggested not retreat, but acceptance. Margaret felt the shift, not in him, but in the space itself. Something receded, something that had once existed between them, now no longer present. The room remained, the light unchanged, the table, the paper, all as they had been. And yet, everything was different. The man turned. The movement was unremarkable, almost ordinary, and yet, within it, there was a finality that Margaret had not allowed herself to remember. He did not look back. The woman did not move. She remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But now, Margaret saw it, not as absence, but as something actively maintained, a distance that had not been imposed upon her, but chosen. The image held, longer than before, as though it required her to remain within it, not merely to observe, but to acknowledge. Margaret felt something within her settle, not resolution, not relief, but recognition. This was the moment, not the hand, not the hesitation, but this, the choice that followed, the one she had not forgotten, but had refused to keep. The image dimmed, slowly, without flicker, without distortion. It did not dissolve, it receded, as though it no longer needed to be shown, because it had been seen. The projector did not continue. There was no residual sound, only silence. Margaret remained where she was. The presence, no longer separate, no longer defined, did not recede. It remained, not as something observing her, but as something she now carried. And in that quiet, unbroken stillness, she understood. There had been no deception imposed upon her, only one she had constructed. And now, it no longer held. Margaret did not leave the theatre at once, though the absence of sound and image might have suggested that there was nothing left to remain for. The silence, however, did not carry the quality of conclusion. Rather, it extended itself in a manner that suggested continuation, though of a different kind, one that no longer required projection or form. She stood for a time she could not measure. The light within the auditorium remained dim, but steady, as though it had settled into a state that no longer fluctuated in response to unseen mechanisms. The rows of seats, which had once receded into shadow, now appeared more clearly, their surfaces undisturbed, their presence neither expectant nor empty, but simply there. Margaret became aware gradually of her own breathing, not as something separate from the space, but as part of it, aligned with the quiet that surrounded her. There was no longer the sensation of being observed, no impression of proximity that suggested another presence. And yet she did not feel alone in the way she once had. The distinction, she realized, had altered. What had once been external, something she could position behind her, or beside her, or within the unseen contours of the room, had resolved itself into something internal, though not entirely contained. It was not a voice, not a thought, but an awareness that no longer required articulation. She turned finally and began to move toward the aisle. The movement felt different now, not hesitant, not compelled, but deliberate, as though each step belonged to her in a way that had not been true before. The seats, as she passed them, no longer suggested observation. They held their silence without implication, their emptiness no longer filled with the residue of unseen witnesses. The dust that had once gathered upon them appeared undisturbed, though Margaret had the impression, not of change, but of having misperceived it before. At the threshold she paused. The lobby lay beyond, its dim light extending toward the door, which now stood partially closed. The angle was different from before, not open, not inviting, but resting in a position that suggested no particular intention. Margaret stepped into the lobby. The air was cooler here, familiar, the scent of dust more pronounced, though no longer carrying the suggestion of disturbance it had before. The ticket counter remained as it had been, the glass dulled, the surfaces untouched. She moved toward the door. There was no urgency in the motion, no impulse to remain, nor to leave more quickly than necessary. She placed her hand upon the surface. For a moment she did not open it. Instead, she stood there, her attention not directed toward the outside, but held within the quiet enclosure of the space she was about to depart. There was no sense of conclusion, no clear demarcation between what had occurred and what would follow, only a subtle shift, a realignment. Margaret opened the door. The light outside had changed. It was later than she expected, though she could not have said how much time had passed. The sky carried the muted tones of early evening. The horizon softened, the distinction between sea and sky less defined. She stepped outside. The air moved lightly across her face, carrying with it the faint scent of salt, and something else, something that suggested distance, though from what she could not say. Margaret did not turn back immediately. She stood for a moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the change in light, the openness of the space after the contained stillness of the theatre. The town lay as it had before, quiet, unchanged, and yet she felt no impulse to measure it against what had occurred. The comparison no longer seemed necessary. She began to walk, not toward any particular destination, but along the path that extended from the theatre, curving gently toward the water. After several steps, she paused, not out of hesitation, but from a quiet awareness. She turned. The theatre stood behind her, its facade unchanged, the sign still faded, the door now closed. There was no visible indication of what had taken place within, no light, No movement, only the structure itself returned to its stillness. Margaret regarded it for a moment. There was no expectation, no anticipation of further revelation, only the recognition that what had been required had been given, and that what remained did not reside there. She turned again and continued walking. In the days that followed, Margaret resumed the structure of her life, though it no longer presented itself as something to be resumed, but as something that continued, altered not in its outward form, but in the quality of her attention. The mornings returned. The light arrived over the water with the same gradual insistence, assembling the horizon from its indistinct beginnings into something that could once again be named. Margaret sat at the table by the window, her hands around her cup, the quiet ritual unfolding as it had before. And yet there was a difference, not in what she saw, but in what she allowed to remain. The memories did not return in fragments, nor did they press upon her with the urgency they had once carried. Instead, they existed within her as part of a continuity she no longer attempted to reorder. The room, the table, the paper, the man, the moment, they did not shift. They did not alter themselves in response to her attention. They remained as they had been. Margaret found that she did not revisit the theatre, not because she avoided it, but because the necessity that had drawn her there had resolved itself in a way that no longer required repetition. She passed it once on her way toward the shore. The building stood unchanged, the door closed, the sign faded, there was no sound, no light, no indication that it held anything beyond its quiet, abandoned presence. Margaret did not stop. She continued walking, her attention directed toward the water, the steady motion of the tide, the quiet persistence of its rhythm. And yet there were moments, subtle, unannounced, when something shifted, not externally, but within her perception, a brief alignment, a sensation of being seen, not from without, but from within the same awareness. Margaret did not resist it. She did not attempt to locate it. It came and went without pattern, without insistence, leaving behind no disturbance, only a quiet acknowledgement. One evening, as the light receded and the house settled into its familiar stillness, she stood again by the window. The glass reflected her image faintly, the interior of the room layered over the dim outline of the outside world. For a moment she regarded it. The features were the same, unchanged, and yet she did not search for discrepancy. She did not test the alignment. She allowed the image to remain as it was. There was no delay, no misalignment, only the quiet presence of herself as she was. Margaret lifted her hand. The reflection followed. Immediately, without variation, she lowered it. The image remained. The moment passed. Outside, the light faded completely. The horizon disappeared into darkness, the distinction between sea and sky dissolving into a single unbroken expanse. Margaret remained at the window. There was no sense of completion, no final understanding that resolved what had been uncovered, only a quiet and enduring awareness that the past did not recede. It did not vanish, it persisted, not as something that demanded attention, but as something that remained, unchanged, within the structure of what had been lived, and that to carry it, not altered, not diminished, but as it was not a burden, but a form of truth. Behind her, the house held its silence. Before her, the darkness extended. And somewhere, though she could not say where, the faintest suggestion of a rhythm remained. Not the projector, not a sound she could identify, but something continuous, unbroken, as though the memory itself had found a different way to endure. Margaret closed her eyes, then opened them again. Nothing had changed, and yet something had, not in the world, but in the way she remained within it. She stood there for a long time, neither waiting nor concluding, the quiet of the evening settling around her without resistance. And in that stillness there was no need to look back, because nothing had been left behind, only understood, and even that not entirely,